Hollywood spent billions making you fall in love with these stars. And it worked. But the children who grew up behind those closed doors saw something the cameras never showed, something so at odds with the legend that most of them waited until their parents were safely gone before they dared to say it out loud. Tonight, they speak. The great profile and the daughter he left in ruins. There are names in Hollywood history that carry a weight beyond fame, names that feel less like identities and more like monuments. John Barrymore was one of those names. Critics on both sides of the Atlantic called his voice the finest instrument on the American stage. His Hamlet, which ran on Broadway in the early 1920s, it was considered the defining classical performance of the century, a standard against which every subsequent interpretation would be measured and found wanting. Audiences did not merely admire John Barrymore, they were stunned by him. His profile was so celebrated that it became its own cultural shorthand. The Great Profile, a nickname he wore with the casual ease of a man entirely comfortable with his own magnificence. He was, by every measure the theatrical world possessed, the genuine article. He was also, by every measure his daughter possessed, largely absent. And what Diana Barrymore did with that absence would become one of the most searingly honest documents Hollywood's golden age ever produced. Written not in anger, but in something considerably more painful than anger. Diana Barrymore published her memoir, Too Much Too Soon, in 1957, 15 years after her father's passing in 1942. She was 33 years old when she wrote it, and already consumed by the alcoholism that would claim her 2 years later at 35. What she produced was not a simple exposure of a famous parent's failings. It was something considerably more difficult and more honest, an attempt by a wounded daughter to understand how a man of such extraordinary gifts could be so completely and consistently lost to himself and to the people who needed him. The memoir was received as a sensation, adapted for the screen within a year, and discussed across the country as the ultimate Hollywood cautionary tale, when what most of those discussions missed was the quality that made it genuinely extraordinary. Not its scandal, but its sorrow. Diana met her father properly for the first time when she was 14 years old. By then, John Barrymore had been married 4 times. His drinking had become so catastrophic that studios were inserting his lines on cue cards just off camera because he could no longer reliably retain them. When he appeared in Diana's life, he was everything the legend promised: charming, hilarious, overwhelming, the kind of company that made every other person in the room feel slightly diminished by comparison. He spent one afternoon teaching her to recite Shakespeare, guiding her through iambic pentameter with a patience and tenderness she had not expected and would never forget. He told her she had talent. He told her the Barrymore name meant something and that she would carry it well. And then he was gone. Weeks would pass. Months. The letters she sent would go unanswered or receive replies so brief they barely qualified as acknowledgement. She had idolized him precisely because he was so rarely present, constructing a father from his films and his reputation and the stories others told about him. And when she finally had the real man in front of her, she discovered that the real man was simultaneously more dazzling and less available than even the legend had suggested. When Diana followed her father into acting, she discovered she had inherited his gifts. When she followed him into alcoholism, she understood, with a clarity that was almost unbearable, that she had inherited his destruction as well. The parallel was so precise and cruelly exact that those who had known both Barrymores saw it immediately and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. Those who knew her during the years she was writing Too Much Too Soon recalled a woman trying to perform a kind of emotional archaeology on herself, digging back through the layers of her own choices to find the point at which her father's absence had become her own undoing. What she found at the bottom of that excavation was not rage. It was love without an object, devotion without a destination, the particular grief of a child who had been given just enough of a parent to understand what she was missing. What makes Diana Barrymore's memoir extraordinary is its compassion. She did not write about her father with rage. She wrote about him with the bewildered, no aching love of a child who had never stopped waiting for him to arrive, and who had finally, in her mid-30s, accepted that he was not coming. She passed away in 1960, 3 years after the memoir's publication, having never found the stability her father never modeled for her. Those who were with her in her final years described a woman who kept photographs of him in her apartment and sometimes simply looked at them without speaking, as if she were still working something out that the memoir had not fully resolved. The great profile's most enduring performance, it turned out, was making the world love him while those closest to him paid the full price of his genius. Yes, and somewhere in that price was a daughter who had spent her life reaching for a father who had taught her Shakespeare once and then disappeared, and who loved him for Shakespeare and forgave him for the disappearing, and never fully recovered from either. The crooner who came home, a different man. The most trusted voice in America came home from the studio and reached for his belt. That is the story Gary Crosby told. And it is the story that shattered one of the Golden Age's most carefully constructed illusions. To understand the scale of what Gary revealed, you have to first understand what Bing Crosby meant to the American public. He was not merely an entertainer. He was a national institution of a particular and reassuring kind. The pipe, the cardigan, the easy laugh, like the voice that floated out of radio sets and into American living rooms on Christmas morning for 3 decades. Going My Way. White Christmas. He had won the Academy Award. He had sold more recordings than any artist of his era. Audiences did not just enjoy Bing Crosby. They trusted him the way they trusted very few public figures before or since. The way you trust something that has been present and reliable and warm for so long that you cannot imagine the world without it. He was warm himself. He was America's father. Or so they believed. His son Gary waited until his father was safely buried before telling a different story. Going My Own Way arrived in 1983, 6 years after Bing Crosby's passing in 1977. Gary alleged corporal punishment administered with a belt and with consistency. Not the occasional disciplinary lapse of an impatient father, but a structured, recurring punishment that those who witnessed it described as something closer to a system than a response. He described weekly weigh-ins, conducted with a precision and a willingness to humiliate that bore no resemblance to the genial father the public had spent decades adoring. The boys would stand on a scale in front of their father, and if the number displeased him, the consequences were immediate and physical. That number became, for those sons, a measure not of their health, but of their standing in their father's eyes. A standing that was always provisional, always one disappointing weigh-in away from withdrawal. He described emotional distance maintained with something close to military discipline. A father whose warmth existed for cameras and for company, and evaporated the moment the public face was no longer required. Brothers Philip and Dennis corroborated portions of Gary's account. What united their testimonies was not any single incident, but the pervasive atmosphere of a household in which the father's approval was the central currency and was almost never freely given. Lindsay, the most wounded of the 4 sons from Bing's first marriage, was lost to tragedy in 1989. A loss that gave Gary's memoir a retrospective weight its critics struggled to dismiss. And yet the story is not as simple as the memoir suggests, because Bing Crosby's second family tells an entirely different story. The children born to his marriage to Catherine Grant, Harry, Mary, and Nathaniel, describe a warm, present, engaged father who attended school events, showed physical affection, and came to ordinary Tuesday dinners with the full attention of a man who understood that ordinary Tuesday dinners were where the real work of fatherhood happened. He was a different father the second time, softer, more available, more willing to show what he felt and to stay in the room when feelings became difficult. Which means the tragedy of Bing Crosby's fatherhood is not that he was incapable of being a good parent. It is that he became one 20 years too late for the sons who needed him first. The first family absorbed whatever ambition and insecurity and suppressed darkness the studio decades had compressed inside him. And the second received whatever wisdom 4 failed sons had painfully purchased on their behalf. Gary Crosby's memoir is disputed and morally unresolved, and that is precisely what makes it true to life. The grief it documents is the ordinary, irreversible kind. The kind that arrives not with a single terrible moment, but with the slow accumulation of absences, of belt buckles, of weigh-ins, of a father who saved his warmth for strangers. And somewhere in that second family, warm, attended to, loved without condition, is the clearest possible evidence of everything the first family never received. The mother behind, Mommy Dearest, when Joan Crawford's will was read aloud after her passing in 1977, it contained 8 words that have never stopped reverberating. Or 8 words directed at her 2 eldest adopted children, Christina and Christopher, that said everything and explained nothing, for reasons which are well known to them. No inheritance, no farewell, no acknowledgement that these 2 people had existed in her life at all. Just that phrase, written in Crawford's own hand, a locked room with no key. What had happened between Joan Crawford and her children that she could not name even in her final document. That is the question Christina Crawford answered 1 year later. And the question Crawford herself never did. Joan Crawford understood image the way a general understands terrain, as something to be controlled, managed, and defended at all costs. Her Brentwood house was immaculate. Not merely clean, but curated. Every surface a statement. Almost every room a set dressed for an audience that was always, in Crawford's imagination, watching. Her fan magazine appearances were choreographed with the same precision she brought to every scene of every film she ever made. She sent elaborate Christmas cards featuring the whole family, posed and perfect. She gave interviews about her parenting philosophy with the fluency of a woman who had thought deeply about the subject. She cultivated the designation of Hollywood's most dedicated mother with ferocious attention. It was, like everything Joan Crawford touched, a performance of the highest order. Technically flawless and emotionally complicated. 1 year after Crawford's passing, her eldest daughter Christina published Mommy Dearest, and the performance ended. The wire hangers. Picture a child awakened past midnight, pulled from sleep to stand in a closet while her mother, still in full makeup, trembling with a fury Christina later described as almost theatrical in its intensity, tore garments from their hangers and demanded an accounting for the offense of wire where only padded hangers were permitted. Christina described this not as a one-time incident, but as representative of a pattern. The unpredictable escalation, the fury that arrived without warning and departed without apology, the sense that any ordinary domestic detail could become the trigger for something much larger and more frightening. The midnight cleaning inspections, conducted at hours when ordinary households were dark and sleeping. Physical punishment administered with a methodical, almost ceremonial control that transformed discipline into something else entirely. The psychological weight of growing up in a household where appearances were not merely important, but were oxygen. Christina Crawford's memoir entered the culture like a depth charge. She had not written it, expecting to be believed by everyone. She had written it because the alternative was to carry the weight of it alone for the rest of her life. Hollywood divided immediately and has never fully reunited. Crawford's younger daughters, Kathy and Cindy, disputed Christina's account publicly and repeatedly, calling it fabricated and motivated by bitterness over that will. Colleagues came forward to describe a woman of warmth and generosity, who bore no resemblance to the figure Christina described. And yet the will remains. Those 8 words remain, written in Crawford's own hand. They are more quietly damning than anything Christina wrote, because they confirm, in the only language Crawford ever fully trusted, that something between her and her eldest children went profoundly and irreparably wrong. You do not exclude your children from your will with a phrase like that, unless there is a reason. Crawford knew the reason. She chose not to share it. She could have left a private letter. She could have addressed it in the will itself. Instead, she left those 8 words. An accusation without a charge, a verdict without a trial, and took the explanation with her. What were the reasons well known to them? Crawford alone knew. Crawford is gone. And the silence she left behind is, in its own way, the most revealing thing she ever said. If you're finding these stories as compelling as we do, please subscribe to Golden Age Files so you never miss another journey into Hollywood's hidden history. There are 8 more revelations ahead, and they grow more extraordinary from here. The genius who forgot he had a daughter. Orson Welles made Citizen Kane at 25 years old. That single fact has distorted his biography ever since. Because when you begin your career with what many critics consider the greatest film ever made, everything that follows exists in its shadow. His subsequent career was a decades-long argument between his genius and the industry's unwillingness to fund it without conditions he could not accept. A series of magnificent fragments and incomplete masterworks. The world could not stop talking about Orson Welles, including the daughter who published her memoir 24 years after his passing and titled it with a precision that says everything. In My Father's Shadow. What was it actually like to be that daughter? To grow up belonging to the most written about filmmaker in American history? Analyzed, celebrated, dissected in 1,000 critical volumes, and to know that none of those volumes contained you? To understand, from a young age, that your father was public property in a way that left almost nothing for the people who actually needed him? Chris Wells Fetter's book arrived in 2009. Her father had passed away in 1985. She had spent the intervening decades not conducting a prosecution, but attempting something considerably more difficult. Trying to see her father clearly, much without the distortion of either idealization or resentment, and to introduce herself to the man she had been given rather than the legend the world had constructed around him. What she documented was a father of overwhelming brilliance and minimal presence. Wells saw his daughter perhaps a dozen times during her childhood, not out of hostility, but out of an absorption in himself so complete that the ordinary obligations of parenthood simply did not register. There was a birthday, her 10th or 11th, when he promised to visit and did not come. No explanation arrived for several weeks. When it did, it was charming and elaborate, and entirely beside the point. There was a school recital he had confirmed he would attend, and the seat reserved for him was still empty when the curtain came down. She was 12 years old. She did not stop saving him a seat for several years after that. Not out of naivety, but out of the particular stubbornness of a child who has decided that hope is worth the cost of occasional devastation. And then, when he did appear, he was extraordinary. And that was its own kind of cruelty. Those who observed him with his daughter recalled a man who was funny and brilliant and overwhelming, who made every visit feel like an event of considerable magnitude. He would fill whatever space he occupied completely, making his daughter feel, for the duration of his presence, that she was the most interesting person he had ever encountered. And then, he would be gone. For months. Sometimes longer. The dazzling visits made the silences harder, not easier to bear, because they proved that the attention existed. He simply chose. He again and again, where to direct it. Chris Wells Fetter's memoir is not an angry book. She loved her father. She understood, as an adult, that the genius which produced Citizen Kane and The Third Man and Touch of Evil consumed the oxygen that might otherwise have sustained the more ordinary human capacities, including the capacity to remember consistently that a daughter existed and needed to be seen. She wrote her memoir not to expose him, but to finally look at him completely, to claim the full complexity of who he was, rather than the simplified version the world's adoration had produced. In doing so, she produced what many critics considered the most honest portrait of Wells ever written, precisely because it was written by the one person he had never fully seen. And the swashbuckler's children inherit a dangerous legend. Errol Flynn made recklessness look magnificent. Captain Blood, The Adventures of Robin Hood, the grin that suggested life was a series of magnificent adventures, requiring only courage and a certain casual disregard for consequences. Flynn was not merely a movie star. He was a romantic ideal made flesh, the embodiment of a fantasy about what it meant to be fully, gloriously alive. He made danger look like the only honest response to a world that rewarded boldness and punished hesitation. And the fantasy was so compelling that the reality behind it went largely unexamined for years. His children inherited the legend. They also inherited everything the legend had been built to conceal. Daughter Rory Flynn, born to his first wife, Lily Demita, who gave extensive interviews after her father's passing in 1959, speaking with a candor the studio era had never permitted. She spoke about a father who was almost entirely absent during her childhood, a man who arrived like a celebration and left like a tide going out, taking something with him each time that took a long time to name. She spoke about the legal proceedings of 1942, in which Flynn was acquitted of serious charges involving 2 young women, but whose details had permanently complicated his legend, and about what it meant to spend a life bearing a name that required constant explanation and occasional defense. She did not speak with bitterness. She spoke with the measured honesty of a woman who had spent decades making peace with a complicated inheritance, and arrived finally, or at something that resembled understanding, if not entirely peace. Her brother Sean Flynn carried the story to its most sobering conclusion. Sean became a photojournalist and war correspondent. Drawn to conflict with an appetite for danger, those who knew him recognized immediately as his father's. He covered the Vietnam War. He covered the civil conflict in Biafra. He went where the danger was greatest, with a consistency his colleagues described not as recklessness, but as compulsion, as though he were pursuing something that kept moving just ahead of him. Those who knew Sean in the field recalled a young man of extraordinary physical courage and his father's effortless charm, who spoke very rarely about Errol Flynn, and who seemed, in his quieter moments, to be working something out that had no available resolution. He disappeared in Cambodia in 1970 while covering the conflict there. He was 30 years old. His body was never recovered. The searches and investigations that followed over subsequent decades produced no definitive answers. Only the permanent, unresolvable absence of a young man who had gone looking for the world his father had always seemed to inhabit and had never come home. Flynn's magnetism was a gift he passed to his children, along with his restlessness and his absolute conviction that danger was always more interesting than safety. Rory spent her life explaining him, defending him when she felt he deserved it, acknowledging his failures when honesty required it. Sean spent his life becoming him, chasing the horizon their father had always seemed to inhabit. Until one day in a Cambodian jungle, the horizon did not give way. Neither child had been given enough of the actual man to do anything else. And Sean Flynn, 30 years old, his body never found, his father's grin somewhere in his face, is the price that legend charged. Atticus Finch came home. A Stranger to Kill a Mockingbird was released in 1962, and Gregory Peck's performance as Atticus Finch did something remarkable. It did not merely win him the Academy Award for Best Actor. It attached his face and his voice permanently to a set of moral qualities that audiences experienced as real rather than performed. Decency, conscience, the quiet, unshowy courage of a man who does what is right because the alternative is unthinkable. Harper Lee herself said that Peck was Atticus. Not that he had played him convincingly, but that he was him. That the character and the actor had merged in a way that happened perhaps once in a generation. That weight Peck wore with characteristic dignity and characteristic reserve for the rest of his life. What his children knew, and what they addressed with care and honesty in interviews following his passing in 2003, is that moral authority on screen and emotional presence at home are not the same capacity and do not necessarily coexist in the same man. The studio system had spent decades teaching its greatest stars to reserve their most powerful emotional performances for the camera. Gregory Peck had learned that lesson more thoroughly than most, and his children grew up on the receiving end of what that lesson cost. And Cecilia Peck and Stephen Peck have both spoken about a father who was genuinely admirable in his public commitments, his opposition to the blacklist at professional risk, his civil rights advocacy when such advocacy was not without consequence, his support for causes he pursued with the same focused intensity he brought to every role. But that intensity had a cost. His love expressed itself through provision and example, and a certain formal attentiveness rather than through the kind of easy, unguarded warmth that children experience as safety. Those who observed the family recalled a household of considerable dignity and carefully maintained emotional distances. A home that felt, in its own way, like a performance of family rather than entirely the thing itself. The children were loved. There was never any question of that. But love delivered from behind a certain reserve is a different thing from love that reaches across the distance between two people and makes them feel found. Then in 1975, Peck's son Jonathan was lost. Cecilia Peck has spoken about the moment her father received the news, how the color left his face in a way she had never seen before and never saw again, how he sat down very slowly and did not speak for a long time. Those who knew Gregory Peck before and after that day described two different men. The lightness that had always existed alongside his gravitas did not survive intact. He became quieter, more inward. He began to speak more openly with his remaining children about things he had previously managed from behind the wall of his reserve. Not dramatically, but in the small, incremental ways that a man of his generation and temperament could manage. He asked more questions. He stayed longer at the table after dinner, as though he had finally understood something about silence that he wished he had understood 20 years earlier, when it might have made a different kind of difference. Atticus Finch, it turned out, was hardest on himself. The man who had played American Conscience on screen had one of his own, and it was considerably less comfortable to live with than the performance had made it appear. We are more than halfway through our list of 11, and we would love to hear from you. Which of these revelations has surprised you most? And which Golden Age star would you like us to explore in a future video? Or leave your answer in the comments below. Your suggestions genuinely shape what we make on this channel. The goddess, her daughter, refused to stop loving. In her final years, Marlene Dietrich lived alone in a Paris apartment on the Avenue Montaigne, the curtains drawn against the daylight, refusing to be seen by almost anyone in the world. The goddess who had defined glamour for 7 decades could not endure being witnessed in the ordinary human process of growing old. She had spent her entire adult life controlling how the world saw her, the lighting, the angle, the costume, the carefully managed distance that always flattered and never revealed. And in her final years, when that control was no longer possible, she removed herself from view entirely. She would permit almost no visitors. There was one exception. Her daughter Maria came whenever she was needed, which, by the end, was often. To understand what that devotion cost, you have to first understand what Marlene Dietrich was. She did not merely achieve fame. She engineered it with a precision and a will that her contemporaries found alternately awe-inspiring and slightly alarming. The tuxedo, the androgynous authority, the voice that seemed to contain everything European sophistication had ever accumulated about irony and desire. She was a deliberate, lifelong construction of herself as living myth, maintained from the 1920s until her final public appearance, with a discipline that bordered on the obsessive. She lit herself for her own home films with the same exacting attention she demanded from studio cinematographers. She had built the image herself, brick by careful brick, across 6 decades, and she understood it better than anyone who had ever attempted to study it from the outside. Her daughter Maria Riva understood it better than anyone. She had been watching it her entire life from the inside. From the vantage point of a child who loves someone completely and is loved in return incompletely, and who spends a lifetime trying to understand what to do with that imbalance. Maria's biography of her mother, published in October of 1992, 5 months after Dietrich's passing that May, is considered among the most authoritative celebrity biographies ever produced. It is also, quietly, one of the most moving books ever written by a child about a parent. Maria had accompanied her mother on her legendary wartime tours as a child. Watching Dietrich command rooms of soldiers with the same total authority she brought to every audience she had ever faced, she had observed, with the particular clarity only a daughter possesses, her mother's absolute prioritization of her own image and legend over every competing claim on her attention, including the competing claim of a child who needed a mother and received instead a front-row seat to one of the great performances of the 20th century. Maria wrote without bitterness, and it is that quality which elevates the biography above memoir and into something closer to literature. She did not excuse her mother. She did not condemn her. She looked at her completely, at the genius and the selfishness and the extraordinary courage and the profound limitations. And she wrote what she saw. Dietrich was what she was. Maria had spent a lifetime learning to see that clearly and to love her anyway, because love that survives clear sight is the only kind worth having. And then came the Paris apartment, the curtains drawn, the recluse years. The goddess who had spent 7 decades constructing an image of total self-sufficiency now needed her daughter for the simplest things. For company in the long evenings, for reassurance in the middle of the night, for the ordinary human presence that Dietrich had spent her entire career concealing her need for. Maria came. Every time. Without condition and without complaint. She held her mother's hand in the dark. She answered questions that did not always have answers. She was there, simply and completely, in the way that Dietrich had never been able to be there for her. One that is the secret at the center of Maria Riva's biography. Not the affairs, or the selfishness, or the consuming self-mythology, but the daughter who loved her through all of it, more completely than she had ever been loved in return, to the very last day. The legend his son had to live inside Tyrone Power was, by the consensus of everyone who worked with him, considerably more than his looks suggested. And his looks suggested something close to physical perfection. The razor's edge, nightmare alley, blood and sand, a range that consistently surprised those who had dismissed him as merely decorative, who discovered too late that behind the face the studios had manufactured into a romantic ideal was an actor of genuine intelligence and ambition who wanted desperately to be taken seriously and was given instead a legend to inhabit. Or he fought throughout his career for roles that would challenge rather than merely display him. And the ones he lost left marks those closest to him could see clearly, even when the cameras captured only the perfection the studios required. He was also, by November of 1958, gone. A fatal episode on a film set in Madrid at the age of 44. He had been filming Solomon and Sheba when his heart gave out during a demanding sword fight sequence. And the cruelty of that particular detail, collapsing in the middle of the kind of swashbuckling adventure his public image had always demanded of him, is not lost on those who knew him. The questions his children inherited had no one left to answer them. Power had taken the answers with him, along with everything else he had never been permitted to say. His son, Tyrone Power Jr., and daughter Romina Power addressed directly, in interviews over the decades that followed, the most persistent and carefully suppressed question surrounding their father's private life. The widespread belief among those who had known him that Power had conducted genuine relationships with men alongside his public identity as Hollywood's great romantic leading man. The studio era had been structurally incapable of acknowledging such a possibility. Power Jr. did not deny the question. He did not sensationalize it. He addressed it with the careful, loving honesty of a son who had spent considerable time arriving at an answer that honored both his love for his father and his commitment to the truth, acknowledging that his father had been a more complex man than the studios had permitted him to appear, and that the complexity deserved acknowledgement rather than continued concealment. What Power Jr. described was not a man living a lie so much as a man living in permanent suspension, unable to be fully honest and unwilling to be fully dishonest, navigating the narrow and exhausting corridor between the two for the entirety of his professional life. Power Jr. has spoken about looking at photographs of his father in his final years and seeing something in the eyes that the publicity stills had always carefully edited out, a fatigue that went deeper than the physical. The look of a man who had been performing a version of himself for so long that the performance and the exhaustion had become indistinguishable. There are photographs from the set of Solomon and Sheba, taken in the weeks before his collapse, one in which Power looks not merely tired, but depleted. as though the reserves he had been drawing on for 20 years had finally run dry. His father had been given a legend to inhabit, and no permission, ever, to step outside it. His children inherited that legend and the silence surrounding it. The legend was magnificent and survives in every frame of every film he made. The silence was what his children actually lived with. A father-shaped space full of questions that arrived 44 years too early and left no one behind to answer them. The perfectionist who couldn't leave the studio behind, Gene Kelly reinvented what the human body could do on film. Singing in the rain, an American in Paris, on the town. A physicality so demanding, so technically precise, and so apparently effortless that audiences watching his work had no idea they were witnessing the product of rehearsal schedules those around him described as something close to relentless. Kelly would arrive at the studio before dawn and remain after everyone else had gone home, running sequences again and again until they met the standard he carried in his head. The joy in his films is real. It is also the product of an almost punishing discipline that his audiences never saw and his children never escaped. His daughter, Bridget Kelly's post-death interviews reveal that her father's perfectionism was not something he was able to leave at the studio when the working day ended. It came home. It sat down at the dinner table, and it measured everything it found there against the only standard Gene Kelly had ever known how to apply. Okay, there was an evening. Bridget has described it with the careful precision of someone who has returned to it many times, when she brought home a school performance she was proud of and set it in front of her father, expecting the recognition she had earned. What she received instead was a series of questions about what she might have done differently, what a higher standard would have required, what the distance was between what she had accomplished and what was genuinely possible. He was not unkind. He was not cruel. He was, in the most complete sense, himself, a man who had spent 30 years asking those same questions of every frame of film he had ever made, and who had no other language for love than the language of improvement. She set the paper down on the table between them and watched him read it. And then she understood at that moment that the father who had made the world feel joy had not yet found a way to let her feel it in his presence, without first measuring the distance between where she was and where she could be. She left the room before he finished reading. He did not follow her. The paper was still on the table the next morning, and neither of them mentioned it again. One of those small household silences that children carry into adulthood and adults carry to their graves. What Bridget has said about that silence is the most affecting thing in all of her accounts of her father. Not that it hurt her, though it did, but that she came to understand it, eventually, as the only way he knew how to say that he believed in her. The language of improvement was the only language of love he had. She had to learn to translate it, and the learning took longer than it should have. Bridget Kelly's account of her father is offered with love and honesty in equal measure. A portrait of a man who had developed one extraordinary human capacity at the partial expense of another. The studio system had rewarded Gene Kelly's perfectionism extravagantly for decades, and he had internalized its demands so completely they became indistinguishable from his own personality. His children grew up reaching for a standard set by one of the greatest performers in film history. That is not a small thing to carry, even when the man who set the standard loved them, as Gene Kelly loved his children, genuinely, and in the only ways the decades of perfectionism had left available to him. The charm that only worked at a distance. Rex Harrison was celebrated for a very particular quality. A brittle, magnificent, impossible sophistication that made even his rudeness seem like a form of superior wit. Professor Henry Higgins in My Fair Lady defined him for a generation. But that quality, the impatience with ordinary human limitation, the absolute certainty of his own superiority, the charm deployed as a kind of controlled weapon, had been present in everything he did before it and everything he did after. He was married 6 times. He won the Academy Award. He was sued, adored, resented, and celebrated in roughly equal measure by the people who knew him well. The man on screen and the man off it were recognizably the same person, which made him either admirably authentic or exhaustingly difficult, depending entirely on what kind of attention you were receiving. His son, Noel Harrison, observed all of this with the particular clarity available only to a child watching a famous parent from the inside, watching the performance switch on for the company and watching what remained when the company was gone. What remained, Noel has suggested, was a quieter and less generous version of the same man. Without the audience to perform for, the charm that defined him had less reason to appear. Noel's post-death interviews describe a father for whom charm was a professional instrument applied with considerable selectivity. It was present in public, available for audiences and interviewers, and for the women Harrison married with a frequency that tells its own story about his relationship with sustained intimacy. 6 marriages suggesting a man who fell in love easily and found the daily work of love considerably more demanding than the initial performance of it. For his son, the charm was less consistently available, replaced in the domestic setting by self-absorption and emotional unpredictability that those close to Harrison described as the private face of his public brilliance. Noel has described watching his father work a room, the way Harrison became more alive, more genuinely warm when there were people watching, and understanding, gradually and with considerable pain, what it meant that the version of his father available to strangers was more generous than the one available at home. Then there is the question of Kay Kendall. This is where Rex Harrison's private history becomes genuinely difficult to hold alongside his public legend. Kendall was the brilliant and beloved comic actress Harrison married in 1957. Funny, warm, luminously talented, one of the most naturally gifted comedians the British cinema had ever produced. What Harrison knew, and what accounts from those close to the situation suggest Kendall may not have been fully told, was that she was suffering from leukemia and that her doctors considered her prognosis grave. Those who spent time with Kendall in her final months recalled a woman who seemed, in unguarded moments, to be reaching for information that was not being offered, asking questions about treatment and timelines that were answered with reassurances rather than facts, expressing a bewildered optimism that those around her found increasingly difficult to sustain. She was vivid and funny and present until very near the end, and those who loved her found her vivacity both inspiring and heartbreaking, because it was the vivacity of a woman who had not been given the full picture. Did Harrison withhold the truth out of protectiveness or self-interest? Kendall passed away in 1959. The question she may never have been permitted to ask remains open. Noel Harrison's account carries something of his father's wit turned inward. A dry, clear-eyed intelligence applied to the question of who Rex Harrison actually was when the performance ended. Charm deployed without accountability is not love, Noel suggests. It is a very good performance of love, and the children of performers sometimes understand better than anyone else the difference between a man giving a great performance and a man actually being present. Rex Harrison gave great performances his entire life. His son spent considerable time after his passing working out what had been underneath them. The answer, when it came, was simpler and sadder than the performances had suggested. If this journey through Hollywood's hidden history has moved you, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who loves classic Hollywood as much as you do. It means everything to this channel and helps us continue bringing these untold stories to light. The conscience of America and the children he couldn't reach. There are performances in the history of American cinema that transcend acting and become something closer to moral testimony. Henry Fonda gave several of them. Young Mr. Lincoln, Tom Joad in The Grapes of Wrath, Juror 8 in 12. Angry Men, the quiet, stubborn conscience of a room full of men who had already made up their minds. He did not appear to be acting. He appeared to be telling the truth, which is the rarest and most valuable thing a screen actor can do. And Fonda did it so consistently that audiences came to believe the man and the performances were the same thing. They trusted him, not merely as an actor, as a man. And the studio system had built that trust carefully and deliberately, because a star the public trusted completely was a star worth protecting completely. And so, Henry Fonda's private life, the emotional distances, the sealed grief, the things his children needed and did not receive, stayed private, the way the studio system had always intended. His daughter Jane learned the truth about her mother's passing from a magazine article she came across by accident. Frances Seymour Brokaw, mother of Jane and Peter Fonda, had been institutionalized for severe depression. She passed away in a psychiatric facility in April of 1950. Jane was 12 years old. Peter was 10. Their father did not tell them the truth about what had happened. He told them she had passed away from a heart condition. A story that was easier to tell and easier to hear, and that served its purpose until the moment it didn't. He managed their understanding of events in the way he managed most difficult emotions, by declining to engage with them directly, by keeping the machinery of ordinary life running as though ordinary life were sufficient to contain what had occurred. Meals were prepared and eaten, school was attended, life proceeded with the careful normalcy of a man who had decided that forward motion was the only available response to grief. Jane discovered the real circumstances of her mother's passing by reading about them in a publication, alone, without preparation, without her father present to absorb any portion of what that information meant to a 12-year-old girl who had been living inside a carefully constructed, alternative version of events. She put the magazine down. She sat with what she had just learned for a very long time. She did not, for a very long time, tell her father what she had read. She had understood by then that there were things he could not discuss. The studio system had taught him that emotions were for the camera. His children had learned to live inside that lesson, whether they had agreed to or not. Peter Fonda's memoir, Don't Tell Dad, published in 1998, gives that household its fullest account. A father who was physically present and emotionally unreachable. A man whose response to his own grief was to seal it so completely that his children could not find him inside it, could not reach him through it. He went to work. He gave extraordinary performances. He came home. He was there and not there simultaneously, present in every room he occupied and absent from every conversation that might have required him to drop the composure that was, by this point in his life, less a choice than a condition. Jane has described in her own memoir the decades she spent in public life, driven significantly by the need to be seen and acknowledged by a man for whom acknowledgement was almost physically impossible to give. The activism, the films, the exercise empire, the marriages, a life of extraordinary energy sustained at least in part by the fuel of a daughter's unanswered need. She had been trying, some in every public arena available to her, to do something large enough that her father would finally look up and see it. And see her, not the actress, not the activist, her. And then there was On Golden Pond. Jane Fonda purchased the rights to Ernest Thompson's play specifically to work alongside her father. She was 43 years old. He was 76 and gravely ill, his health declining with the particular speed that sometimes accompanies a body that has finally decided it has done enough. She had read the play and understood immediately what it was. A story about an emotionally remote aging father and the daughter who has spent her life needing him to finally see her. And she understood that if she could put that story in front of her father with a camera running, she might finally have the conversation that 40 years of ordinary life had never permitted. She did not merely act in the film. She produced it. She raised the money. She assembled the cast. She brought Katharine Hepburn on board, which was its own kind of poetry given the history between Hepburn and the Fonda family. She put them both in front of a lens and let the material do what she could not do alone, because Henry Fonda had always been more fluent in performance than in life. And Jane Fonda, his daughter, had learned that truth young and decided finally to use it. Henry Fonda wept during filming. Those present on set recalled the moment with a specificity that suggests it marked them permanently. A great actor, a man of extraordinary emotional control, finally losing that control in front of his daughter in a scene that was supposed to be fiction and turned out to be something else entirely. Jane had never seen her father cry before, not once in all the years before that afternoon on that set, with those cameras running and the fiction of the scene finally dissolving into the truth of the people performing it. She did not stop the scene. She stayed in it. She let the moment be what it was. Not a breakdown, but a breakthrough. The things she had been working toward for 40 years, finally arriving in the only place her father had ever been fully present. He won the Academy Award for his performance, his only Oscar after a career that had produced some of the defining screen work of the 20th century. He was too ill to attend the ceremony. Jane accepted it on his behalf. She stood at that podium holding her father's Oscar and looking out at the assembled history of an industry her father had helped to define. And whatever she felt in that moment, she carried it with the composure of a woman who had spent a lifetime learning, in the most difficult possible school, how to hold things that were too large to show. Henry Fonda passed away 4 months later. He was 77 years old. He has made more than 80 films. And he had wept once on camera in front of his daughter in a scene that was supposed to be fiction and was the truest thing either of them had ever done. The screen's great American conscience found, in his final film, the emotional language he had withheld for a lifetime, and he used it just in time to tell his daughter what she had been waiting to hear since she was 12 years old and reading about her mother in a magazine, alone, without him. It was not the conversation either of them had deserved. It was the one they got. And Jane Fonda, who had spent decades learning to accept what she was given rather than grieve what she had not been given, accepted it with the grace of a woman who understood that sometimes the truth arrives late and imperfectly and through a motion picture camera, and that even then, it is worth more than the silence that preceded it. These 11 stories end not where they began, in the glamour and the carefully managed glitter of Hollywood's golden age, but somewhere more true and more tender than glamour ever reaches. The children who spoke did not do so to diminish what their parents built. They spoke because the truth, however long it waits, has a way of demanding to be told. And what they revealed was not the ruin of these legends, but the completion of them. the missing dimension that makes these extraordinary people fully, finally human. The studios of the Golden Age were in the business of icons. What these sons and daughters gave us, at considerable personal cost, was something the studios never intended and could never manufacture. The real people. The whole story. The private weight carried behind every luminous performance we have ever loved. The stars of Hollywood's Golden Age shine no less brightly for it. If anything, they shine truer. Thank you so much for spending this time with us on Golden Age Files. If these stories have moved you or given you a new way of seeing the icons you have cherished for so long, please hit the like button and share this video with someone who loves classic Hollywood as much as you do. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss another journey into the real lives behind the silver screen. And leave us a comment telling us which of these 11 revelations stayed with you most, and which Golden Age star you would like us to explore next time. We read every comment, and your suggestions genuinely shape what we make. Until next time, this is Golden Age Files, where the glamour was real, and so was everything behind it.